It was supposed to be a calm Saturday morning, just me, my fishing rod, and the peaceful lake I've owned for over a decade. But what started as a relaxing day quickly turned into a scene out of a neighborhood drama. I was mid-cast, enjoying the quiet, when I heard footsteps behind me and a sharp voice barking, "You can't fish here!" I turned around to see a woman I'd never met before, clipboard in hand, with an HOA badge pinned to her vest. She wasn't just passing by. She was on a mission. Apparently, this woman had just moved into the new development across the tree line and thought her homeowners association gave her some kind of authority over my private lake. Before I could say a word, she pulled out her phone and announced she was calling 911 to report a trespasser fishing illegally. I could have laughed if I wasn't so stunned. She didn't even let me explain. Within minutes, a sheriff's vehicle rolled up the gravel path. By then, a few other HOA board members had gathered near the dock, whispering and pointing like they were about to witness some grand takedown. What they didn't know, and what would flip the whole situation on its head, was that not only was I fishing legally, but the very land and water they were standing on belonged to me. But instead of yelling back or trying to argue, I decided to let the paperwork, and a surprising twist, do the talking. As the deputy stepped out of his cruiser, the HOA woman marched over to him like she was leading a battalion. "That man is trespassing and fishing illegally," she snapped, pointing at me like I was some criminal. The other board members nodded in agreement, clearly trying to back her up. I stayed calm, didn't even reel in my line. I knew what they didn't, that every square inch of that lake, the dock, and even the trail they walked in on, was legally mine. I'd bought the property years ago before any of those cookie-cutter houses were even built. The deputy looked between us, then over at me. "Sir, do you have any identification or proof you're allowed to be here?" he asked, his tone polite, but serious. I nodded, reached into my tackle box, and handed him a laminated copy of my property deed. His eyes scanned it, then widened slightly. He looked up at me with a knowing glance, then turned back to the woman. "Ma'am, I think you're going to want to step back for a moment." She froze. "What? No, he's lying. This is HOA property." "No, ma'am," the deputy replied, holding up the deed. "This lake and the surrounding land are privately owned by him." The silence that followed was heavy. Her confident smirk faded fast, replaced by something between confusion and embarrassment. But I wasn't done. I had more than just a deed. I had plans that would make them think twice before stepping on my land again. The deputy gave the HOA a firm nod, motioning for them to back off, but the woman, Karen, I'd later learn her name, wasn't ready to let go. "This can't be right. That lake is part of our community viewshed. We have rules about who can fish and when," she insisted, her voice rising with each word. I just sat there on my folding chair, lying still in the water, trying not to laugh. It was like watching someone try to rewrite reality because it didn't suit them. Karen wasn't just some busybody. Word around town was she'd moved in 6 months ago and quickly worked her way onto the HOA board, where she'd started cracking down on just about everything. Lawn height, mailbox colors, even the shade of mulch people used. Her need for control went way beyond normal. She saw my lake as something that disturbed her idea of neighborhood uniformity. But the truth was, the lake existed long before their subdivision, and legally, it was never part of their HOA territory. The real twist? The HOA had actually tried to buy an easement for the lake a few years back, but their offer was insulting, and I turned it down. Ever since then, they'd been bitter. Karen had simply picked up that fight like it was personal. She hadn't. Just called the cops on a man fishing. She'd walked into a battle she didn't even understand. And I was just getting started making it clear to her exactly where her authority stopped. Karen didn't back down easily. Even after the deputy told her I was well within my rights to fish on my own land, she started snapping photos of me, the lake, my truck, anything she could. "This is far from over," she hissed before storming back toward her SUV. I watched her speed off, tires flinging gravel, and I knew she was cooking something up. A week later, I got a certified letter from the HOA's attorney claiming I was creating a nuisance by allowing unauthorized access to the lake. An outrageous claim, considering I'd never invited a soul besides my own family, but things got weirder. I began noticing unfamiliar cars slowly driving by my property, some stopping to take pictures. One day, I found a drone hovering over my dock, buzzing like a nosy fly. That's when I realized this wasn't just about fishing, it was about them trying to find any crack in my property rights to claim control. Karen was obsessed, and she'd roped the whole HOA into backing her mission. I started pulling my property records, every survey, every zoning document just in case. Then came the kicker. A notice from the county appeared on my gate. Complaint. Filed. Unauthorized structure near HOA boundary. It had Karen's fingerprints all over it. She was trying to push me into a legal mess, hoping I'd give in or sell off. But what she didn't know was that I'd already contacted a real estate attorney and a local news outlet. If Karen wanted a fight over my lake, she was about to get it. Just when I thought I was ready to handle everything Karen could throw at me, another curveball came flying in, literally. One morning, I woke up to find several "no trespassing" HOA jurisdiction signs planted along the shoreline of my lake, half of them staked inside my property line. They weren't just making false claims anymore, they were trying to physically mark territory that wasn't theirs. And the wildest part? They'd filed an application with the county to redraw the neighborhood boundaries to include part of my land. It was a bold move, and it didn't make any legal sense, but it meant they were serious. That's when I dug deeper and discovered Karen had somehow convinced a few other HOA members that the lake should be shared community space. She'd held a private meeting without notifying all members and voted on a petition that framed my private lake as a protected wetland area. Now they were trying to label it for public conservation, which would strip my ownership rights altogether. I couldn't believe the lengths they were going to just to control something they didn't even build or pay for. The local news team I'd spoken to earlier finally got back to me. They were interested, really interested. I handed over every document, every photo, and every complaint Karen had filed. But I also knew that exposing them publicly might only make things worse, especially if Karen felt her image was at risk. I had no idea just how far she'd go next. The day the county inspector showed up was the turning point. Karen stood at the edge of my dock in her usual smug stance, arms folded, convinced she'd finally won. She had printed out pages of the so-called wetland petition, presenting it like it was already law. But the inspector wasn't impressed. In fact, after a few minutes reviewing the documents I had provided, original property deeds, zoning maps, and drone footage showing the untouched, man-made origin of the lake, he made it clear that the HOA had zero jurisdiction. My lake was privately owned, legally documented, and had no environmental protections that applied to their claim. Karen's face changed fast. First confusion, then denial, and finally panic. But before she could argue, the inspector handed her a notice. It turned out the fake signs she'd posted and the boundary manipulation attempt actually violated county regulations. Falsifying zoning boundaries? That was a serious offense. The county would be launching a formal investigation into the HOA board's conduct, starting with her. Thinking the drama was over, I exhaled, until I noticed a sleek black car parked behind the inspector's truck. A sharply dressed man stepped out and introduced himself as a lawyer. Not for me, but for the developer who originally sold the land. Apparently, there was a clause in one of the oldest contracts that had just resurfaced, and it might affect more than just my lake. As everyone turned to him, he smiled slightly and said, "This changes everything." The lawyer's discovery turned out to be a blessing in disguise. That hidden clause, It confirmed that my land, including the lake, was entirely exempt from any future HOA expansions or changes in jurisdiction. Apparently, the original developer had put it in as a safeguard decades ago, just in case someone tried to pull exactly what Karen was attempting. The county officials verified it within days, and the HOA's claims completely unraveled Karen, who once confidently waived papers and threatened lawsuits, now faced her own disciplinary hearing from the HOA board. Turns out, several members had no idea she was acting on their behalf and quickly voted to remove her. The tension that once echoed around the lake finally broke. I got an official apology letter from the HOA and even a visit from a few board members who admitted they'd let things go too far without proper oversight over time. Things quieted down. I went back to enjoying peaceful mornings fishing on my dock without the fear of flashing lights or angry voices. My lake remained untouched, my rights respected, and the neighbors who once watched silently, they started waving again. This story wasn't just about property lines or HOA overreach. It was about standing your ground when you know you're right and not letting noise drown out facts. If you ever feel overwhelmed by red,